Hello, and welcome to Countdown Election Q&A. My name is Brendan Quinn. I'm a Senior Communications Manager here at Campaign Legal Center. Thank you all for joining us. Campaign Legal Center is a nonpartisan legal organization dedicated to solving a wide range of challenges facing American democracy. We fight for every American's freedom to vote and participate meaningfully in the democratic process, particularly Americans who have faced political barriers because of their race, ethnicity, or economic status. Our work is especially relevant at this moment. The 2024 election is underway, and Campaign Legal Center is ensuring every voter can participate in our democratic process. We know there are many questions surrounding this election, and we had a great conversation with so many folks just a few weeks ago, where we had the chance to discuss everything from election certification to new campaign finance rules. And now, due to popular demand for our experts, we are so excited to continue that conversation today, and with our panel to have more of your questions answered. Now, if we are not able to answer your question today and you are a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegalcenter.org. If we are not able to answer your question today and you are not a member of the press, please email your questions to info@campaignlegal.org. And now, I'd like to introduce today's panel. First, Trevor Potter is CLC's president and founder, leading our efforts to advance democracy through law. A Republican former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, Trevor was general counsel to John McCain's 2000 and 2008 campaigns and an advisor to the drafters of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. He works at the intersection of money, law, and politics for decades, leveraging his expertise by teaching campaign finance law, testifying before Congress on federal election proposals, and during the 2020 election season, being named to the cross-partisan National Task Force on Election Crises. Bruce Spba is Senior Vice President at CLC, where he brings over 30 years of experience fighting for civil rights and civil liberties, voting rights, consumer protection, and antitrust enforcement. In addition to founding his own firm, Bruce has held management positions as a partner at 2 national law firms. He has had an active election law practice for many years, having tried numerous voting rights and redistricting cases, and argued voting rights appeals in state Supreme Courts, U.S. Circuit Courts, and the United States Supreme Court. Bruce has also been a longtime advocate for statehood in Washington, D.C. Danielle Lang is Senior Director of Voting Rights at CLC, where she leads CLC's efforts to safeguard the freedom to vote. She litigates in state and federal courts from trial to the Supreme Court and advocates for equitable and meaningful voter access at all levels of government. Before leading several of CLC's successful cases to protect voting rights, she represented low-wage immigrant workers in wage and hour discrimination and human trafficking matters. Adav Nodi is Executive Director at CLC, where he coordinates and oversees all programmatic activities across ethics, campaign finance, voting rights, and redistricting. Adav has conducted dozens of constitutional cases in trial and appellate courts and the United States Supreme Court. He advises members of Congress and other policymakers on advancing democracy through legislation. Prior to joining CLC, Adav served for more than 10 years in nonpartisan leadership capacities within the Office of the General Counsel of the Federal Election Commission and served as a Special Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. Thank you to the members of this panel for joining us today and answering what I'm sure are questions that are on the minds of everyone before voters on Election Day. So let's jump right in. The first question we have asks, can Americans who are overseas, such as active military abroad, still vote? And how can we make sure those votes are counted? Let's start with Danielle on this one.
Thanks, Brendan. Absolutely. Americans who are living abroad, including our active military, but of course not limited to our active military, are entirely eligible to vote. And they have a number of protections under federal law to make sure that that vote can be effective. So we know that folks who are living abroad and active military can face various hurdles to voting, establishing residency, meeting various verification requirements, kind of the issues around mail voting, having delays, especially when you're dealing with postal services abroad. And that is why Congress passed several laws protecting overseas and military voters, and those laws have been on the books for quite some time.
Just to add to what Danielle said, the courts have swiftly rejected attempts by partisan actors to interfere with the right of residents living abroad, including our military members, to vote. For instance, in North Carolina, recently, we represented the Secure Families Initiative and Count Every Hero. And North Carolina's long-standing law that ensures the right of military members and their families to vote against a challenge by partisan actors there.
And in fact, there were 3 of those lawsuits filed in North Carolina, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And as of today, the very last of the 3 courts has ruled to kick out those lawsuits. So now in both Michigan, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, all 3 states, the courts have kicked out those lawsuits.
Well, moving on then, under the ECRA, a 3-judge panel can consider legal challenges to a state's certification of presidential electors on an expedited timeline. But what is that appeals process and timetable beyond that, or for other types of challenges? Can these challenges bog down the judicial system?
I'm happy to take that, Brendan. So let me give a little bit of background for folks who might not be as steeped in this stuff as the question asker. So after the 2020 election, in 2022, Congress, with a large bipartisan majority, passed a law that was intended to make it much harder to carry out the sorts of election subversion efforts we saw in the post-2020 election period. That law did a number of things. I expect we'll touch on several of them today. One of them that this question is about was to create a dedicated special court that would decide on a very expedited basis any disputes that might come out of a state's certification of who won its presidential election. So under this new federal law, there's a 5-day window in December for litigation to potentially challenge a state's certification of its presidential winner as either if there is no certification or if the certification is unlawful in some way. So I understand the question to be asking, can that process be abused? Is there a right of appeal to it? And the answer is no, it's not really subject to abuse, at least not easily, because written into the law is that these cases, if they're brought to this special court, have to be resolved within that 5-day period. And that includes potentially appeal to the United States Supreme Court if the Supreme Court were to take the case. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more later about sort of the role of the Supreme Court here. But in terms of what the question is asking, could that procedure be used to like gum up the works and like prevent the certification of the election going forward? No, there's a very tight timeline. It's all spelled out in the law, and the disputes will get resolved on that appropriate timeline.
Thanks, Adad. That was very, very helpful. Moving on, unless anybody has anything else to add to that, we are seeing from a number of people that asked questions for today that there is concern about disruptions at polling places, both on election day, and that people may be afraid to vote. Are you aware of any plans to monitor polling places on November 5th? And what should people do about poll watchers that are trained by Cleta Mitchell and others? Trevor, you haven't spoken yet. Let's start with you.
Sure. Well, to start with, people are voting now. They've been voting for a bit. There's absentee voting, mail voting. So there are ways, a range of ways in which people are voting, and law enforcement and election officials are being careful to observe things like drop boxes and early voting sites to make sure that they are perfectly safe, secure, and that voters have a good experience. But for people coming on election day, the important thing to remember is that the poll workers we're going to run into, I intend to vote about a mile down the road from my house. I will walk in and see neighbors, friends, people from the community who are hardworking local folk doing their job. And to the extent that there's any threat at all to them, that's obviously a terrible thing, but will be dealt with, I think, immediately by the election officials and local law enforcement. So certainly voting in person should be a congenial experience, not a problem. Now, the second part of your question asks about the partisan poll watchers, which is really a different group of people put in by the political parties, allowed to observe, but not allowed to interfere with voting. And they should not be preventing anyone from voting or hassling voters. If they are, there is a national vote protection line, an election hotline that people can call. Danielle, do you know that number?
I sure do. Yes. So if anyone is facing any troubles at the polls, whether it be voter intimidation or your name turns out not to be on the voter registration list or something else that seems off, you can always call election protection. That's nonpartisan. It's 1-866-R-VOTE, 866-R-VOTE. That's 866-687-8683. That's going to be manned in the days leading up to Election Day for early voting, as well as all day when the polls are open on Election Day. So you can always reach a volunteer that will be able to kind of connect you to the resources that you need. But as Trevor's explained, of course, there are isolated incidents anytime we're doing as big an endeavor as an election day across the entire country. But after doing this years and years in a row, I can say when there are isolated problems, they are dealt with very quickly, because as Trevor says, we have really dedicated election officials that know what the rules of the road are. They know that they have the authority to resolve any issues of voter intimidation and always do so really quickly.
Thank you, Trevor and Danielle. And just before we move on, I'm going to repeat that hotline again. That is 866-OUR-VOTE. That is 866-687-8683. Now, before votes are cast on Election Day, one thing we all see on our television screens or social media feeds are ads, and those are all funded by various spending groups and people. So what actions are CLC and other groups pursuing right now as a result of the inaction we're seeing from the Federal Election Commission, which oversees these elections? And what are we doing about the FEC's recent trend towards deregulation?
Let me dive in a bit as a former FEC commissioner and chair. The commission is set up with 6 commissioners, not more than 3 of any one party, which effectively has meant 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and a requirement for 4 votes, so a majority to take any action. Unfortunately, for the last 10 years or more, what we have seen much of the time is the commission deadlocking on important questions. What sort of disclosure should there be? How to make sure the law is enforced? Whether to find a violation when a complaint is filed that shows that the law has been broken. The commission has been deadlocking 3-3, which generally means it can't go forward at all. In that case, Campaign Legal Center has been filing because Congress had anticipated there might be deadlocks and provided a way for complainants at the commission to then go to court. And so we've had a whole series of cases where CLC has gone to court to force the commission to act despite its initial deadlock. And we've been very active in that field and will continue to be. There has been a recent change in that one of the new Democratic commissioners has been siding with the Republicans to deregulate in some areas to allow, for instance, coordination between campaigns and supposedly completely independent outside spending groups. And there we call out the FEC's misreading of the law and are doing the best we can to point out why this is a real problem.
And if I could just piggyback on that to touch briefly on a sort of issue of spending in the current election that I'm sure is on people's minds, and I'm sure there's multiple questions in the queue about it. So I'll just talk about that now. So Elon Musk and what he's doing. So among the many ways that Elon Musk is spending money in this election is basically paying people to register to vote or to enter a lottery where they get paid if they register to vote, and that's unlawful under federal law. But sort of bigger picture, the systemic problem that what Musk is doing highlights is that we have a system where very, very wealthy people, corporations, and special interests can spend tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars to try to influence the results of federal elections. And a lot of that is being driven by the ineffectiveness and the lack of enforcement at the Federal Election Commission that Trevor described. So although what Elon Musk is doing is unusual in sort of how high profile is and how he's seeking out the attention, because most of these very wealthy donors actually try to hide their participation. It's unusual in that sense, but the fact of a very wealthy person dumping this kind of money to try to influence a federal election is unfortunately not that uncommon.
Right. Well, moving a little bit more towards the post-election process, what is CLC doing in terms of post-election threats and responses? Beyond Georgia's hand count issue, are there other partisan actors pushing voter suppression and election chaos efforts elsewhere?
Sure, I can jump in on that, Brendan. There are a couple of different things, and certainly CLC is carefully monitoring and has carefully prepared with our partners for these types of issues for several years now. And one of them is the possibility that a rogue actor might try to not certify the results of an election in localities. We've seen this happen before, or attempts to do this in 2022 and 2020. And one of the things that the ECRA that Adav spoke of earlier does is it sets very clear timelines for state certifications. We have worked very closely with many states to make sure that their state laws conform to those deadlines. It makes clear who is supposed to do the certifying. It should be the governor unless another official has been designated by the state prior to election day. It is not a discretionary act. It's a ministerial act, and it's not optional. There are times, like the old song says, for everything there's a season, right? There are times for contests, for audits. I don't think those words are actually in the song, but that's all provided for by law. And a local official doesn't have the discretion to just say, well, I don't like what has happened here, so I'm not going to certify. And I think the ECRA, among other safeguards, will prevent that from happening. The other thing that we are looking at carefully.
Bruce, if I could just dive in there to say, I do think we recognize that somewhere a county or more than one county in some very close state may refuse to certify or attempt not to certify, saying either we want to do a hand count, not a machine count, which isn't provided for by law, or we don't trust the machines, or we think something wrong happened somewhere else. So we will likely see something like that. As you pointed out, it doesn't have any basis in law. And the result will be that election officials or the state or the candidates end up going to court and getting a court order requiring certification because it isn't a discretionary act. But it's just worth flagging that we shouldn't be surprised if we see that. We will just know that it's something that will have to be dealt with and will be by the legal system to ensure that certification goes forward.
That's absolutely right, Trevor. And we, the courts effectively dealt with that even before some of the fine tuning and clarification that we have with the ECRA and some of these revised state laws. So we're confident that the court system should be able to adequately deal with that should and probably when it arises. Another thing that we are looking at is this idea of mass challenges, where oftentimes bad actors will bring a slew of challenges to voters' registration in an effort to gum up the works and to disenfranchise people. We have, among other things, we've dealt with it in part with litigation, but it's not just litigation. We've also provided guidance to 11 states that on dealing with that and on the tools that they have in current law to combat mass challenges and to dismiss them so that they don't result in anybody being disenfranchised or in gumming up the system and creating long lines on election day.
I'll just add on here to say, what I think Trevor and Bruce were both kind of alluding to here is that we have really strong safeguards in our electoral processes, but we do also have some really bad actors these days seeking to undermine those electoral practices. And so I want to flag a couple other areas where we are trying to fight back against those bad actors. So mass challenges are definitely an area where we have concern. To just back up and explain a little bit what mass challenges are, it's, basically vigilante individuals who take it upon themselves to try to do kind of what we call list maintenance, try to find ineligible voters on the rolls. They're not professionals. They don't know how to do this. They end up submitting kind of thousands of challenges of folks who are totally eligible. And election officials know how to deal with that, but it can be burdensome on them. And our guidance is meant to kind of provide election officials with as much knowledge as they can have to kind of deal with those en masse as they are provided to them en masse. Another area where we kind of see bad actors laying the groundwork for challenges to our election integrity are, purges that are coming from election officials themselves during the 90-day quiet period. What is the 90-day quiet period? There's no reason anybody would know that except for election officials. But the 90 days before a federal election is when election officials have to stop mucking up with the, changing the voter registration rolls, kicking people off the rolls, because there's too much of a danger that they'll get it wrong at the last minute and eligible voters won't be able to cast their ballots. So it's been the law for 30 years that you cannot engage in list maintenance of the voter registration rolls in the 90 days before an election. Election officials know that. They've known it for 30 years. And yet we have seen some election officials this cycle intentionally conduct what we would call list maintenance and trying to purge people from the rolls during that 90-day period. So we sued. We sued in both Virginia and Alabama, and we won. In both of those states, election officials were ordered to put the folks on the rolls, back on the rolls that they had purged unlawfully during that 90-day quiet period. That Virginia case is actually on appeal with an emergency stay application to the Supreme Court. So we expect to hear from the Supreme Court today on that. But the law is clear. The National Voter Registration Act has been the law for 30 years. It says you can't kick people off the rolls in those 90 days before an election. And there's a really good reason for that, which is that even when election officials are doing their very best, these types of processes get it wrong. The processes that we've challenged in Virginia and Alabama got it really wrong. In Alabama, we were able to quickly identify that over 2/3 of the people on the rolls were definitely eligible, and who knows how many more are eligible. In Virginia, we got the list of purged voters on a Tuesday, and by the time we were in court on Thursday morning, we had declarations from affected citizens who are eligible citizens on the rolls that were being canceled because of the illegal program. So that's a little bit of the work that we're doing on the front end to make sure that everyone can vote before those results are certified.
Well, that's incredible, Danielle, and it's incredible that is moving so quickly. And if we hear back from the Supreme Court before this is over, please chime in. And I'm sure the audience is eager to know how it goes. But to that end, what checks and balances are in place within these states or any other state that can ensure that our elections are safe and secure?
I can take, or I could start with that one, Brendan. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's something that Trevor talked about earlier, that we need to remember that these elections are run by very dedicated local election officials. They are our friends and our neighbors. They work tirelessly to just try to make sure everybody who's eligible can vote, and that the system works as it is supposed to. Very dedicated individuals that I've had the honor and pleasure to meet and work with over the years. They also are working in teams made up of many people, including both nonpartisan poll workers, but the parties also have their observers, and so can look and see whether there is anything untoward going on. And many of these election officials, after what happened in 2020, are providing unprecedented access, some of them with cameras and the like, to allow people to see exactly what is going on, which is these dedicated individuals trying to secure the vote and count it as accurately and quickly as possible. It should be noted, because there's a lot of talk about election equipment being hacked. Election equipment is not connected to the internet, so it's not possible to hack the election equipment via the internet. There's a paper trail in almost all cases, and it can be and is audited to some degree. And then lastly, I'll say that, as I was saying before, there are numerous avenues to redress any malfeasance or mistake that one or the other parties believes has happened. You have the recounts, you have contests, you have audits in close cases, but it can't be based on speculation and wild conspiracy theories like we saw in 22. It's got to be based on proof, or the challenge will be rejected by the courts.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Anyone have anything else to add on that?
No, I think Bruce captured it. The key thing here is we expect there'll be circumstances where there are unsubstantiated challenges, and if you don't present evidence, then the courts will look at it and decline to proceed with that challenge.
So while we may hear significant noise from people who are making these challenges, many of them will probably not be legitimate.
Yeah, if legitimate challenges present evidence that something went wrong and that the result of the election could be changed in that specific vote counting situation, ballots were not counted that should have been, something like that, and those are what election officials and courts are used to dealing with and adjudicating.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Well, Danielle, I'm still thinking about those cases that you were talking about where you kind of stepped in and were preventing people who are eligible voters from being taken off the voter rolls. Can you expand on what other election-related lawsuits CLC is following and where any hotspots seem to be? And is there any validity to any of these lawsuits?
So we are seeing a lot of litigation around the election already. We were expecting that. We saw a lot of litigation after the election in 2020. I think that some actors are just getting a head start. We've referred to a few of these already. So I've talked about the kind of election purge lawsuits that we've brought, protecting that 90-day quiet period. We've also seen and referenced here today a few lawsuits that were filed challenging uniform and overseas voters. All of those have already been kicked out of court in all 3 states. And we've seen a variety of other litigation filed as well in a bunch of states, usually challenging the voter registration rolls at this stage in the game. And repeatedly, courts take a look, as Trevor said, and see if there's any kind of merit here, whether or not the parties are coming forward with evidence to challenge the systems, and they usually aren't, and so they usually lose. Unsurprisingly, the hotspots are the swing states. In an election, when we're getting close to the election litigation often does kind of coalesce around those national swing states, because that's where partisan actors are focused. So while Campaign Legal Center is really focused on ensuring the right to vote for everyone across the country, partisan actors and bad actors are usually focused on where they can try to muck up the results in a way that will be meaningful to national election outcomes. So the hotspots are in a lot of predictable states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona. And so that's where we'll be, focusing a lot of our efforts in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you. So do we expect a repeat of challenges to the legitimacy of election results like we saw in 2020? What types of post-election challenges would be most likely to reach the Supreme Court? And what would be the prospects given the court's current composition?
I'm happy to take that, Brendan. Thanks. I mean, will we see challenges to the results of the election? Probably. Trevor already alluded to the fact that we're, fairly likely to see some county somewhere in the United States, maybe a few counties, at least try to not certify. But that is different than, sort of the question of litigation that could, potentially even reach the Supreme Court and what would happen there. When we talk about the Supreme Court, I mean, I think we have to be candid. The current Supreme Court on basically every democracy issue, voting rights, gerrymandering, money in politics, ethics, bribery, presidential immunity. This current court is very is not a good actor on any of those issues. It has a long track record of really doing damage to the legal frameworks there. But there is one huge exception, and it's relevant to this conversation, which is the 2020 election. And in 2020, there was enormous pressure put on the Supreme Court by the folks who were trying to overturn that election. And really, the game plan was to try to get something to the Supreme Court, no matter how flimsy, on the theory that then the Supreme Court would sort of come up with a way to overturn the election results. And the court was pressured very heavily to do that. And it didn't even come close, right? The court didn't even take the cases that had been presented to it as vehicles for that sort of subversion, much less take the cases and, in fact, subvert the election results, again, under intense pressure. I think that, and the current court is, for these purposes, comprised the same as the 2020 court, more or less. And so, I think there are, let's be candid, there are 9 justices. There are probably 3 who would, in some situations, vote to subvert an election. But I think it's only 3. It is very likely not 4, and it is almost certainly not 5. And so while there could be a case that gets to the Supreme Court, as there were efforts to do in 2020, if it's as, frivolous and devoid of merit as everything we saw in that election, I would expect it to be, because there are unlikely to be significant issues with this election for all the reasons that we've all discussed here today. I would expect the Supreme Court similarly to either not take the case or affirm the propriety of the results.
I will note what Adav said just a moment ago about kind of the Supreme Court having a pretty good track record from 2020 on that particular question, but not a great track record when it has to when it comes to protecting voters generally. So there are two matters that are before the Supreme Court right now on emergency applications. One of them is our Virginia case that I mentioned earlier. The other is a case coming out of Pennsylvania about a Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling that said that certain types of provisional ballots must be counted. And I'm hopeful in both of those cases that the Supreme Court will reject those applications because they are meritless. They contradict 30-year-old federal law, and they also ask the Supreme Court to step in on kind of ordinary matters of statutory interpretation of state law, which is not something that the Supreme Court usually does. It usually leaves that to state Supreme Courts. So I'm hopeful on both of those fronts. But it is a place where I'm a little more nervous, I would say, than I am on kind of post-election litigation, just because of the track record that Adav mentions, that the court is often not particularly careful about how its rulings might affect voters. And we did see earlier this summer a kind of similarly inconsiderate of voters ruling out of Arizona on an emergency stay application. So it's not impossible that we might see some harmful decisions from the Supreme Court. I'm hopeful that we won't, but it's not impossible. And I mentioned that because I want folks to kind of know the difference, right? We might see some decisions we really disagree with in this pre-election period. I don't think that necessarily forecasts anything about how the Supreme Court might behave kind of in the post-election category.
And I would just note that of the two cases that Danielle spoke of that are before the court now, they have in them important legal issues, particularly Pennsylvania, in terms of the allegation that what the decision the Pennsylvania Supreme Court made was contrary to the election laws passed by the legislature. So that raises, again, the sort of ghostly spectacle of the independent legislature doctrine, the idea that legislatures somehow are not constrained by state courts. But those cases also involve a very small number of potential voters and ballots, far less than the margin in any of these states last time. So these are, we'll see what the court does with them. They may or may not raise some important legal issues, but they're not going to show, they don't show any sign of being the sorts of cases that could actually affect the result of this election right now. Similarly, there's a case in the Fifth Circuit challenging ballots that are received after election date that will get resolved by the legal system going forward, could have effect on future elections, but there's no sign that that's going to have any effect on this election because it is not in place. That decision is not in place for this election.
Well, it's interesting that you mention that ruling out of the Fifth Circuit, Trevor, because we actually have people in the comments asking questions about that case. And people are asking if they should be worried about their vote counting if their ballot arrives after Election Day.
Well, it's a matter of state law as to when ballots can arrive. Some states say that it has to be postmarked before Election Day, but as long as it is, they will count it whenever it arrives, even if it's a couple days afterwards. Other states say it has to actually arrive by Election Day, or they won't count it. So that's the first issue, is the question of whether what state law says. But the Fifth Circuit case involves a state that does allow ballots to arrive afterwards, as long as they've been cast before on Election Day. And the Fifth Circuit, I think incorrectly, had this sort of weird idea that everything has to stop on Election Day, is the best interpretation of their decision, that you can vote before, but somehow you can't count ballots that are cast in the election period or on election day if they're not counted by the end of election day. And that doesn't make any sense. There are states that have lots of ballots and it takes them days to count them post-election. But because they were all cast before the election or on election day, they count. So I think that there's a problem with that decision. But in terms of the question that was asked, the Fifth Circuit was quite clear. It was not ordering the state to stop counting ballots that arrive after the election. It sent the case back to the district court. I don't think it's even finalized its decision for the district court to act on it. And in giving instructions to the district court, they specifically said that the court should take into account the judicial principle that you shouldn't change rules in the middle of an election when voters have settled expectations. So I think all of us in this briefing would agree that it is exceedingly unlikely that Fifth Circuit decision will affect the actual counting of votes this year, as opposed to in future elections.
I think that's absolutely right, Trevor. The only thing I would add is I think it's exceedingly unlikely that will be the outcome. I think it is potentially very likely that you will see some bad actors again kind of add this to their kind of treasure trove of arguments in trying to challenge election results. So Mississippi is not the only state that has a law like this. Mississippi is the state that this particular challenge in the Fifth Circuit came out of. But Nevada has a law like this. A number of states that have other close races have laws like this as well. And so you can imagine a world where bad actors point to this not yet final, no remedy decision in the Fifth Circuit and say that they're bringing a challenge on that basis. But this brings us full circle back to 2020 and the principle that Trevor just mentioned, which is that courts do not change the rules of the road after the election. So these types of challenges, if they were brought after the election, are not only kind of flawed on the merits, but they would be too late. And we have no reason to believe that courts would kind of change course in their kind of steadfast refusal to kind of change the rules of the road after the election, which is exactly what we saw in 2020.
Thank you very much for that clarification. So speaking about election results, our last question here is how long is it going to take for the election results to be called? And why might we not know the election results on election night?
Who would you like to start with that one, Brendan?
Why don't you start with this one, Trevor?
All right. Well, I do not expect to go to bed on election night knowing who won. There will be trends, perhaps. There could be surprises, but it's important to remember that when we're sitting watching news or watching websites on election night, those are not in any sense final results or official results. But we saw last time Fox News call Arizona correctly, as it turned out, for Biden. Well, they did so with lots of votes still to be counted. But their experts had looked at where those votes were, the areas of the state, and had said, well, there are umpteen votes still there, 10,000 or something, but that's an area that's a strong Democratic area. So Biden is ahead, and when those votes are eventually counted, they're not going to diminish his lead and change the result. So what we're seeing on election night are prognostications. Now, in some states, they will actually have concluded the counting of 99% of the ballots, and they will know a pretty clear final result. It's still not official. It's not certified. It could be challenged, and candidates could say they want to recount if the election were close. But there are going to be some states where we have a pretty good idea, absent some divine intervention, of what happened on election night. And then there are going to be other states that are close. And important to remember that some of those states we expect to be close include states that are very slow to process absentee ballots, advanced ballots. And some of those states, state laws clearly say they can't start processing the ballots until election day. And processing means making sure that there's a signature on the envelope, comparing it to the voter registration, and raising a question if the signatures don't look the same. In some states like Pennsylvania, there are very complicated rules about, does it have an internal secrecy envelope? And if not, what happens? So those take a while. And the effect of that is on election night, we are going to be told the vote totals on the machines from the day of. And in some states, that will barely be half the total votes cast. And thus, the prognosticators are going to then talk about which party had a bigger get out the vote drive or bigger absentee ballot drive. But we're not going to know on election night. I think we wake up the morning after the election, states still will have been counting. The vote totals will be further along, and we'll have a sense of whether one candidate is heading to an electoral college victory or whether it's going to be too close to know for a while. And remembering, as we've just been discussing, you have states where ballots can come in after the election. Not a huge number, but if it's really tight, those are going to matter. Overseas military ballots still coming in. And then there are provisional ballots. And this is an area in any close race that the lawyers for the two sides will spend a lot of time on, because provisional ballots are ballots where someone came and for whatever reason, they didn't vote a regular ballot that is immediately counted. Maybe there was a question about their registration or their name, or they forgot their ID. Or the question was, they requested a mail-in ballot. Do the records show that it was already delivered and ready to be counted? In which case the provisional ballot won't count. Or did they throw out the mail ballot and they're going to vote? All of these would yield what's called a provisional ballot, which simply means the person votes, but it is not yet counted absent some additional action. They come back with an ID. The question that was raised is resolved. And so those can take a while to sort out after the election. And if someone has won a state by 100,000 votes, that doesn't matter, and no one's going to spend much time worrying about it. But if someone's ahead by a couple thousand votes and there are 10,000 provisional ballots out there, then that will become the focus of counting and legal arguments in the state. So the bottom line is our elections are never final on election night. What's happened in recent close elections is a lot more attention and spotlights have been focused on what happens the next day and the next weeks in terms of making sure every vote is counted, every eligible voter who has voted is in fact included in the final totals, and that ineligible voters and ballots are not counted. And that's, depending on how close it is, a system that can take all the way through till early December, when states are certifying their results and their electors. The deadline, as Bob said earlier, is December 11th for doing that.
Thank you, Trevor. So basically, there are numerous factors that could come into play as to why, when we go to bed on election night, even when we wake up Wednesday morning, that we might not know the winner of numerous races. So I want to move on to our final thoughts now, but there is an important question that popped in from the comments section that I want to address. So Lori asked what is going to happen regarding the ballot box that was destroyed, and I think Adav has an answer to this.
Yeah, thank you for asking the question. So it gives us a chance to highlight one of the dynamics that's at play in this election. that folks who are here listening can help do something about. So there have been one, maybe two instances in the last few days of somebody, vandalizing a ballot drop box somewhere. That's one or two instances in the thousands and thousands and thousands of ballot boxes that are set up all over the country. Similarly, in the 2022 election, there was an incident where somebody who was armed, visibly armed, sort of took it upon themselves to stake out a ballot drop box in Arizona. These two instances, one in 2022, one recently, got an enormous amount of media attention. And that's a real problem because they affected nobody's ability to vote. The ballot boxes at issue here, they're going to be able to notify most of the people who are affected, and the ones who don't will be able to track their ballots, see that they didn't arrive, and cast new ones. But it created this idea that ricocheted all around social media that they're staking out the ballot boxes, they're destroying the ballot boxes. No, somebody somewhere did something dumb and criminal, and is probably going to get caught. But I would urge folks, when they see these stories, to recognize them for the isolated instances they are, not share them, not disseminate them, not read it as any sort of systemic problem or attack on the system. That everybody's going to be able to vote, and nobody should worry that if they're using a ballot box, that somebody's going to come along and vandalize it. That is exceedingly rare, and not something that voters need to worry about. Everybody just needs to vote and not stress about these extremely rare instances.
Voting by mail is and remains extremely safe. So I want to move on to our closing thoughts. And before we log off today, I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to leave us with some final thoughts on what to expect ahead of Election Day. Let's start with Bruce.
Thank you, Brendan. So first, I want to make a clarification on something that I said in an earlier answer. I said that the machines are not connected to the internet, and what I was referring to is the ballot tabulation machines are not connected to the internet. There are election devices, for instance, the registration devices, the poll books, which actually is a significant improvement. It helps a lot of people to be able to vote who otherwise might have been turned away in prior years. But what I was trying to address was these wild conspiracy theories that were promoted last time, that somehow Venezuela was, infiltrating the counting machines and changing votes from one candidate to the other. I think my wrap up would be the serenity prayer, which is God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think this kind of banks off of some of the things that my fellow panelists have been saying. We certainly at CLC and our partners have been focusing on the things that we can change and trying to make sure that every eligible voter is able to cast their vote and have that vote counted. But we can't allow these instances like Adav was mentioning, or fears of what the courts may or may not do, to lead us to give up on the process. And so I would just encourage everybody to exercise their freedom to vote. And because when we allow ourselves to be overcome by these types of rumors and concerns, it can lead too many of our fellow citizens to simply give up and say, well, the system's rigged, so I'm not gonna bother to vote anyhow. And that probably doesn't describe anybody on this program, but I'm sure you know people who feel that way. And so I just encourage folks to try to encourage people to overcome those fears.
Thank you. Danielle, what are your closing thoughts?
Thank you for that, Bruce. I think that that's a good thing to keep. All of those are good things to keep in mind, and I will keep that prayer in mind in the next 7 days, for sure, for myself. On a personal level, I'm a Pennsylvania voter. And so I guess I would echo some of what Trevor said, which is that Pennsylvania is one of those places where we're not going to have the results as quickly because it is a place that doesn't pre-process its absentee votes. And there are a lot of people who vote by mail, myself included. So I would like my vote to count. And so I need everybody to be patient in getting those results because my vote may not be counted on election day. The other thing I would note is that voters have a lot of power. They have a power to make sure that they cast their ballot. We have a lot of improvements in our election system that can help you make sure that your ballot counts too. So most states these days have ways for you to be able to track your mail ballot. So if you choose to vote by mail, you can also, in many states, although not all, we should make it all, you can track your ballot. Know when, I have already been told by the city of Philadelphia when my ballot was sent out, when it was received, and I will hear from them when it is actually counted. And those kinds of ballot tracking allow me to be proactive, that if there was a problem with my ballot, I could kind of reach out and try to fix it. So recognize that you have power and make sure that you act on that power. That's something that is within your control, as Bruce would say. So thank you all. Go out and vote and, have some patience, not just for the next 7 days, but in the days thereafter.
Thank you. Adab, what are your closing thoughts?
I don't have much to add to what Bruce and Danielle have covered. I think we're ready for the election. There may be attempts to challenge the results after, but election officials and the democracy community and those who protect elections are ready for those efforts, and we'll deal with them. And I am genuinely confident that the system will hold.
Yes, we are. And Trevor, we will close out with you.
Well, I think Adab has said it for all of us. We've had a good conversation today discussing all sorts of issues that may arise pre and post election. But at the end of the day, I think we believe that the country is going to get through it, and it's going to have a system that works. And at the end of the day, we're going to know who the rightful winner is.
Well, thank you all very much then. I'll leave you all with this. If you have additional questions or would like more information, you can email us at info@campaignlegalcenter.org. I would like to once again thank all of our speakers and thank all of you for joining us today. Please enjoy the rest of the day. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to vote.
Thanks, Brendan.